she fled from war and memories. But in her mother's town, she heard a howl coming from a ruined church. Behind its walls, a dog kept a secret that had survived for decades. And in the cemetery, a discovery awaited her that took her breath away. See what this encounter turned into. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The long road stretched ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that shimmered beneath the desert sun. Maria Johnson kept her hand steady on the wheel, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped it harder than she meant to. The city was far behind her now, receding in her rearview mirror, like a shadow that had finally loosened its hold. For years, she had told herself she could live there, among the endless noise, hiding her scars beneath routines and distractions. But the noise had only sharpened her pain, every siren in the night echoing like mortar fire, every shouted argument outside her apartment twisting into phantom voices from Afghanistan. She could not escape the past in a city that never let her breathe. Beside her in the passenger seat, her daughter Layla pressed her forehead to the glass, eyes wide at the vast horizon opening before them. The child's hair, thick and tightly curled, gleamed under the slanting light that slipped through the car window. She had never known this land, except in stories her grandmother once whispered before she passed away. Tales of a small town where the air was clear and the nights held stars so bright you could almost hear them sing. For Layla, this was an adventure, a chance to meet a place that felt half imaginary. For Maria, it was both escape and reckoning, a journey into the bones of her family's history. The desert rolled outward on every side, endless, indifferent. The earth was painted in ochre and rust, dotted with stubborn shrubs that clung to life with roots twisted deep into dry ground. The sky was a pitiless expanse, brilliant and cloudless, pressing down with a weight that reminded Maria too much of the valley she had patrolled overseas. The heat rising from the ground warped the air into trembling currents, and each shimmer tugged at her memory. Soldiers trudging under heavy packs, the metallic taste of dust, the silence that followed an explosion. Her chest tightened as she drove, and for a moment she considered turning back. But then Layla laughed softly, not at anything in particular, simply at the sight of a tumbleweed bouncing across the road, as though it were a toy tossed by an invisible hand. The sound cut through Maria's heaviness like a blade through fog. This was why she had come. For her daughter, she had to face the ghosts she carried. For her daughter, she had to carve out a new life. The first sign of the town appeared at the crest of a hill. A wooden board leaned on a splintered post, its letters almost erased by decades of sun and wind. The paint had peeled so thoroughly that only one word remained legible: "Welcome." The rest had flaked into silence. Maria slowed as they descended into the hollow where the town lay, a scattering of houses and shops left behind by time. Buildings stood in uneven rows, their windows dark and broken, their roofs sagging inward as though bent beneath invisible burdens. The old general store's porch leaned to one side, its sign swinging on a single chain. A gas station with rusted pumps jutted into the street like relics from another age. Yet not everything was dead. Here and there, Maria caught signs of life: a garden bed, carefully tended outside a small house, children's bicycles propped against a fence, laundry hanging limp on a line. It was a place caught between survival and abandonment, clinging to identity with the stubbornness of desert plants. She guided the car down the quiet street until she reached the edge of town, where her mother's house waited. The structure was small, built of weathered wood and pale stone, with a porch that had bowed under years of storms. The roofline dipped, shingles missing like teeth in a tired smile. Maria parked the car and stepped out, the door creaking as though it had not been opened in years. The heat of the day pressed against her skin, and the silence around her was so complete that it seemed to hum. Layla skipped up the steps, her lightness a counterpoint to the heaviness in her mother's chest. She pushed open the front door, and a cloud of dust lifted into the air. The smell of old wood, dry plaster, and time itself met them as they stepped inside. Sunlight fell in fractured beams through the shutters, illuminating shelves lined with forgotten books, a rocking chair in the corner, and a wall decorated with faded photographs. In one frame, Maria saw her mother as a young girl, standing barefoot in the yard, her smile wide and unguarded. Maria ran her hand along the worn banister of the staircase, feeling the grooves left by countless fingers long gone. The house spoke of endurance, of generations who had lived and left, and of her own mother, whose memory was both wound and anchor. For the first time since she had left the army, Maria felt the presence of something larger than herself, a lineage she was part of, a root system reaching down into soil she had nearly forgotten. They spent the afternoon unpacking modest belongings. Layla explored every corner with restless curiosity, finding old dolls in a chest, yellowed letters in a drawer, pressed flowers between the pages of a Bible. She carried each discovery to her mother, as though presenting treasure. Maria moved more slowly, each step measured, her mind caught between exhaustion and reverence. When evening began to draw its shadow over the desert, they stepped outside. The horizon flared with color, the sky streaked in shades of orange and crimson that deepened into purple at the edges. The air cooled slightly, though the earth still radiated heat from beneath their boots. Maria breathed in, trying to let the silence wash over her. Then the sound came. A long, resonant howl that lifted from the far side of town, rolling through the empty streets and echoing off the hollowed shells of buildings. It was no ordinary canine sound. It carried a weight that pinned Maria where she stood, her breath caught in her chest. The tone was deep, mournful, stretched thin with sorrow, as if it rose from the earth itself. Layla stiffened, her eyes wide, but instead of fear, she looked almost enchanted. Maria's gaze followed the sound to its source. A figure emerged at the edge of the street, a large German shepherd with a coat of silver gray streaked with white. Its body was lean but strong, its movements precise, not the erratic steps of a stray, but the steady gait of an animal with purpose. The dog walked with head held high, ignoring the two newcomers entirely, as though the town itself commanded its attention. It padded through the dust, the last rays of the sun striking its coat, until it glowed faintly, like tarnished steel. Maria and Layla watched in silence as it moved unhurriedly toward the ruins of a stone church at the far end of the street. The church was skeletal, its roof collapsed, its windows gaping voids. Yet the dog approached it as though entering a sanctuary. At the threshold, the animal paused, lifted its head, and released another howl, long and low, reverberating against the ruined walls. The sound carried across the town, filling every corner with its lament. Maria felt the vibration in her bones, as though the cry had unlocked something buried inside her. Images from years past surged into her mind. Dusty roads, comrades falling, the suffocating silence after chaos. She clenched her fists, trying to ground herself in the present, but the resonance would not let her go. The dog stepped into the shadows of the church and disappeared from view. The last note of its call faded into stillness, leaving the air charged with expectation. Maria and Layla remained standing, their bodies tense, as though waiting for something more to happen. When nothing did, the silence returned, heavier now, as though it carried the memory of what they had just witnessed. Maria placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, not to comfort, but to steady herself. Layla looked up at her, eyes shining, mouth parted in wonder. For the girl, the moment was magical. For Maria, it was haunting. The sun dipped fully below the horizon, and the desert surrendered to twilight. A thin line of stars began to prick the sky, faint against the fading glow. Maria turned back to the house, her legs moving as though through water. Layla lingered a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the church at the edge of the street, before following her mother inside. That night, Maria lay awake in the narrow bed that had once belonged to her mother, the old springs creaking under her weight. The darkness of the room pressed in close, but it was not the dark that unsettled her. It was the echo of that howl, replaying endlessly in her mind. It was a sound of loss, of loyalty, of a grief that refused to die. It was, she realized, a sound she understood too well. And as sleep finally claimed her in shallow, restless waves, Maria knew one truth above all. The dog and its mournful ritual were not just curiosities of this forgotten town. They were a summons, a call she could not ignore. The morning after their first night in the house was filled with the quiet tasks of settling in, though nothing could erase the echo of the howl that had carried through the streets the evening before. Maria rose early, her body locked into the habit of military waking, though no réveillé or urgent order had stirred her. The silence itself had awakened her, that profound emptiness broken only by the sigh of desert wind. Layla slept longer, curled into the blankets, but when she finally emerged, her eyes were bright, her words tumbling over one another with excitement as she described what they had witnessed the night before. She had not dreamed of fear, but of wonder, as though the howl had opened a doorway into a secret world. For Maria, the sound was no less unforgettable, but its weight pressed down upon her. Where her daughter saw magic, she felt grief, a grief that resonated with her own. They fell quickly into a rhythm, though it was one imposed by the slow-moving town rather than any design of their own. Days stretched long, the heat of the sun pressing upon them, and work became the only means to make the hours pass. Maria repaired the sagging porch steps, cleared years of wind-blown debris from the yard, and forced stubborn shutters to open again. Layla, full of boundless energy, explored every room of the house and then the streets beyond, returning with tales of buildings that leaned like tired men, of a general store that smelled of dust and mice, of a schoolhouse where the blackboard still bore faint chalk lines from a hand stilled decades ago. The town seemed to her like a stage left, waiting for actors to return. Yet whatever they did, however much they scrubbed or swept or hammered, the day always folded itself toward evening, and with it came the ritual. As the sun began to slide down the arc of the sky, the air would cool and lengthen into stillness, and Maria and Layla would both find their eyes drifting toward the church at the edge of town. They did not speak of it, not openly, but the weight of expectation grew with every hour of fading light. Then, as if summoned by the sinking sun, the figure appeared. The German shepherd came each evening without fail, his coat glowing silver and white in the last light. His steps were steady, his path unchanging. He walked directly to the ruined church as though called by some ancient duty. Inside, Maria and Layla knew he would take his place in the center of the nave and lift his head to let loose that haunting lament. Though Maria tried, she could not mistake the sound for anything ordinary. It was not hunger, not warning, not mere instinct. It was ritual, sacred in its repetition, sorrow etched into sound. Each time Maria heard it, memories clawed at her. She would close her eyes and see the desert of another land, soldiers moving through dust, the sudden eruption of violence, the silence that followed. The howl echoed the voices of men she had lost, comrades who had once been her family. She felt her chest tighten until she thought she might cry out herself. Yet she never did. She clenched her jaw, held her breath, forced herself to endure. Still, the sound lingered long after the dog had vanished into night. Layla's reaction was different. She stood spellbound each time, her small face illuminated by the glow of the sunset. She seemed to draw strength from the sight, her young heart interpreting the sorrow as something noble. To her, the dog wasn't a ghost, but a guardian, a presence who honored the forgotten. She whispered once, not to her mother but to herself, that the animal was singing to the sky so the stars would remember. Days passed like this, one folding into the next, each marked by the evening vigil. Maria tried to distract herself with her camera, lifting the lens to frame the decayed buildings, to trap their stillness in an image she could control. Behind the glass, the world simplified, its chaos reduced to geometry and light. She captured the long shadows cast by warped window frames, the sun's burnished reflection in broken glass, the way weeds forced their way through cracks in stone. Yet she knew the photographs were no longer her true purpose. They were excuses to remain in the streets, waiting for dusk, waiting for the sound that tore her open night after night. One evening she positioned herself closer to the church, standing in the shadow of the general store's broken wall. She told herself she was there for the light, for the way the setting sun transformed the stone. But in truth, she wanted to see more. She wanted proof of what she already suspected, that the ritual was precise, that it was more than coincidence. And so she watched as the dog padded through the threshold and across the nave. It sat in the same place, upon a slightly raised stone, its posture proud and unwavering. The head tilted back, the chest expanded, and then the sound came. It rose through the air like smoke, heavy with sorrow, stretching into the vastness above. Maria felt her heart lurch as though she had been struck. Her hand trembled so violently she could barely keep the camera steady, though she did not press the shutter. It felt sacrilegious to trap the moment, to pin down something that lived only in the expanse of air and memory. When the howl faded and the silence returned, Maria waited for the dog to leave. But instead of slipping immediately into the desert as she had always assumed, the animal turned and moved behind the church. Curiosity overcame hesitation. The next morning, after Layla had run off to play near the old schoolhouse, Maria followed the path herself. Behind the ruined stone walls, she found what the twilight had hidden: a cemetery, small and forgotten. A rusted fence sagged in the dust, its gate broken. Crosses leaned at odd angles, many so weathered that they seemed no more than sticks pressed into earth. Stones stood cracked and faded, their inscriptions eroded by wind until names were nearly illegible. Maria moved carefully among them, the silence of the place weighing heavily on her. At the far edge, half concealed by thorny brush, she found two markers side by side. One was taller, carved of stone, its letters nearly erased but still discernible: Reverend Thomas Miller, a date from the early 1930s. The other was smaller, unadorned, a slab of granite pressed into the ground without name or date. Its simplicity struck her like a blow. She remembered the way the dog had lain upon that spot, the way he had rested his head on his paws in the twilight. That evening she returned with Layla, and together they watched the vigil unfold again. As the sun fell, the shepherd moved into the church, gave his mournful cry, and then padded quietly to the cemetery. He lay in the same corner, facing the anonymous stone, and remained there until darkness forced Maria and her daughter to retreat. The pattern was clear. It was not random. The dog's sorrow was tied to this place, to these graves. to a story buried as deeply as the bodies beneath the soil. Layla's hand slipped into her mother's as they watched, her young voice filled with awe as she whispered about the loyalty of animals, about love that did not fade even after death. Maria's heart clenched. She recognized herself in that ritual, in the way the dog repeated its grief, as if duty demanded it. She too was trapped in remembrance, unable to release the faces of those who had fallen. The town itself seemed complicit, its silence compounding the mystery. Each day Maria felt the pull grow stronger, the sense that the land was urging her to look deeper, to unearth the truth. She no longer walked the streets idly. She studied them with the eyes of an investigator, searching for signs that could explain the vigil. Her camera became not just an artist's tool, but an archive, capturing details for later inspection. The worn stones of the church, the faded lettering on markers, the way shadows fell across the ground at different hours. Yet for all her searching, she found no answers, only more questions. Who had Reverend Miller been? Who was buried beneath the anonymous stone? And why, nearly a century later, did this dog echo the grief of a companion long gone? The repetition of the ritual burned these questions into her mind, questions that refused to fade. By the end of that second week, Maria realized the truth she had been avoiding. She had not come here merely to escape the city. She had come here to find something, though she did not yet know what. The dog, the church, the graves. They were threads leading her toward a story that demanded to be remembered. And in that story, she sensed, lay not only the key to the mystery of the town, but perhaps a way to understand her own unending sorrow. As the desert night stretched its blanket of stars overhead, Maria sat awake at the kitchen table of her mother's house, the silence deep around her. Layla slept peacefully upstairs, untouched by the ghosts that tormented her mother. Outside, the faintest echo of a howl still hung in the air, long after the dog had vanished into darkness. Maria closed her eyes and breathed it in. She knew she could not stop now. The shadows of the past were calling, and she would have to follow them. The nights in the town had become a rhythm Maria could not ignore. Each day seemed to circle toward evening, when the shepherd's cry rose once again and pulled her deeper into the mystery. Sleep eluded her more often than not. She would sit at the kitchen table beneath the dim light of a single lamp, her daughter's quiet breathing upstairs like a fragile reassurance, and the echo of the howl would run through her chest until she thought she might break. It was no longer a curiosity. It was a demand. The dog was mourning something real, and she needed to know what it was. Her decision to search for answers came as naturally as drawing breath. In the army, when confronted with an unknown, she had been trained to investigate, to gather intelligence, to piece together fragments until a picture formed. This was no different. She could not silence the cry by ignoring it, so she would learn its source. At dawn, she packed Layla's breakfast and left her with instructions not to wander too far while she drove toward the county seat, a small town just a handful of miles away where records might still be kept. The drive was short but disorienting. The landscape shifted from the skeletal quiet of her mother's town into a place where life still pulsed. Streets were paved, businesses open, voices rose and fell in conversation, and the sight of children playing on sidewalks struck Maria with unexpected pain. She remembered cobble markets full of sound, full of laughter, just before the world collapsed into fire and ruin. She had to grip the wheel tightly and remind herself that she was safe here, that this was not the same. The courthouse stood as a squat, brick building with weathered steps leading to its doors. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink, of a century of records held within narrow drawers and dusty shelves. A clerk, her hair silver and tied into a neat bun, directed Maria to the archives in the basement. The room was dim, the hum of old machines vibrating in the silence. Maria sat at a microfilm reader and began the slow work of turning reels, scanning pages of yellowed newspapers filled with headlines about harvest yields, community picnics, and mining accidents. The words blurred together, but she forced herself to continue, her discipline carrying her through. At last, she found what she sought, an obituary dated November of 1933. The words were formal, stiff in their brevity, yet within them she found the man whose name she had seen etched into the stone by the church. Reverend Thomas Miller, a veteran of the Great War, praised for his service both to his country and to his congregation. The obituary described him as a man of unwavering faith who had refused to leave the town even as others abandoned it, staying with his flock until the very end. It was brief, but Maria lingered over every word, her throat tight. A veteran like her. A man who had seen war, who had chosen solitude afterward, who had carried sorrow in his eyes. The kinship was immediate and profound. She pressed her hand against the paper, as though she could feel his presence through the thin, fragile film. Yet nowhere in the obituary was there mention of a dog. No companion, no loyal friend. No echo of the shepherd that had mourned him. Frustration rose sharp within her. The official record had no space for the detail that mattered most. She searched census lists, church registers, any scrap of information that might reveal more, but all she found were the bare outlines of a life. Dates, addresses, lists of services performed. The man remained a shadow, his grief and his love invisible to the pages of history. Maria leaned back in the chair, staring at the blank glow of the microfilm screen. The howl of the shepherd rose again in her mind, more insistent than ever. If the written record could not tell her, she would need to search another way. Not through the voices of officials, but through the voices of those who had lived, who had remembered. The living history, not the sterile one. She asked the clerk about property records, about families who might have been among the last to leave the town. The woman's eyes lit with recognition at a name. Tays, a family that had lived on land bordering the church, among the oldest in the region. She scribbled an address onto a slip of paper and handed it across the counter. A descendant still lived nearby, a woman named Alara. Maria folded the note carefully and left, her pulse quickening with anticipation. The road to Alara's house wound away from the main highway into a stretch of desert where adobe homes sat rooted in the earth like natural extensions of the land itself. The house she sought was modest, its walls the color of clay, a small garden blooming stubbornly with desert flowers. On the porch sat the shepherd. His head lifted as Maria's truck pulled to a stop, his eyes intelligent and steady. He did not bark, did not move toward her with aggression or fear. He simply watched, as if measuring her presence. Maria's breath caught. It was the same dog, the same coat of silver and white, the same posture of solemn purpose. To see him here, in daylight, was to realize that he was not just a ghost tied to the ruins. He was flesh and blood, and yet more than either. The door opened, and a woman stepped outside. Alara was tall, her dark hair streaked with silver, her posture unbowed by time. Her face was lined, not with weakness, but with dignity, each crease a testament to years endured. She regarded Maria with cautious patience, her eyes sharp as she took in the stranger standing before her. Maria introduced herself, her voice low but steady. She explained why she had come, how she had seen the shepherd night after night, how she had found the graves behind the church, how she believed there was a story that demanded to be remembered. Alara listened without interruption, her gaze shifting once toward the dog, who had now risen to stand at her side. At length she nodded and gestured for Maria to follow her inside. The interior of the house was cool and dim, filled with woven rugs and pottery, photographs of family lining the walls. The smell of earth and herbs lingered in the air. At a small wooden table, Alara placed an object wrapped in deerskin. She unfolded it with deliberate care, revealing a diary bound in cracked leather. The pages within were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. Alara explained that it had belonged to her great-grandmother, one of the last to leave the town. She slid the book toward Maria and pointed to an entry. Maria leaned forward, her eyes tracing the delicate script. The words on the page, dated from 1933, told a story that stopped her breath. They described Reverend Miller, who had refused to leave even when the last wagons rolled away, who had stayed to tend the souls buried in the yard of his church. They spoke of his sadness, the shadows in his eyes left by the war, and they spoke of his companion, a German shepherd named Deacon, a shadow at his side, a protector, a friend whose loyalty seemed boundless. Further entries recounted his passing, peaceful in his sleep, and the dog's refusal to leave the graveside. Deacon had lain upon the fresh earth, refusing food and water, his body growing frail but his resolve unbroken. For days he kept his vigil, until at last he too had gone still, his head resting upon his paws. The final note recorded that he was buried beside his master, the small stone marking his devotion. Maria's vision blurred as she read, her throat constricting. Here was the truth that the official records had ignored, preserved only in the private words of a woman who had borne witness. Loyalty stronger than hunger, stronger than death itself. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of it settle into her chest. It was more than history. It was a mirror. She saw herself in the dog's vigil, in the refusal to leave behind those who had fallen, even when the world had moved on. When she opened her eyes again, the shepherd lay at her feet, his gaze fixed upon her. Alara's voice was quiet as she explained that his name was Echo. He had come to her as a pup, abandoned by the road, fearful of people. But from the moment he had discovered the ruins of the church, he had returned each evening without fail. To Alara, it was no haunting, but an echo, a resonance left behind by Deacon's devotion, heard by a soul who knew abandonment himself. Maria reached down and brushed her fingers over Echo's fur. The dog did not flinch. His eyes were calm, as though he recognized in her the same wound that lived within him. For the first time in years, Maria felt tears spill freely, not as an ambush of grief, but as release. She had found the story, and in it, she had found herself. When she left Alara's house that evening, diary notes still imprinted upon her mind, the desert stretched wide and solemn around her. The ruins of the town no longer felt empty. They were filled with presence, with memory, with loyalty that time could not erase. And Maria knew then that she could not remain a bystander. She would bear witness. She would tell the story of the Reverend and his dog, of love that refused to die, of Echo who carried that memory still. In honoring them, she might at last find a way to honor her own fallen. The drive back from Alara's house left Maria with a silence heavier than any she had carried before, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the quiet that follows revelation, the stillness after a storm, when the air feels washed clean. The diary's words burned into her mind, each line about Reverend Miller and Deacon settling deep inside her, as though they were not history, but instructions, guidance written across time. She returned to the small house at the edge of her mother's town and found Layla waiting on the porch steps, her legs swinging idly, her face eager to hear what her mother had learned. Maria sat beside her and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, not with the heaviness that had weighed her down since their arrival, but with a new steadiness. The girl looked up into her mother's eyes and saw something different there, though she could not yet give it a name. The days that followed unfolded differently from the weeks before. Where once Maria had wandered the streets with her camera, taking images of broken wood and cracked glass, as though documenting ruins was her only task, now she began to see with purpose. Every frame of her lens became part of a larger story, not a study of decay, but a chronicle of memory. She called the project in her mind Echo of Loyalty, for it was no longer about the emptiness of the town, but about the persistence of devotion that had survived nearly a century. She photographed the church with its roof open to the sky, the light spilling through broken windows like blessings. She photographed the cemetery, the tall stone of Reverend Miller, and the nameless slab beside it, humble yet unshakable. She waited for the right hours when the sun painted the stones in gold, when shadows crossed them like veils of reverence. Echo himself became part of her work. At first, she captured him from a distance, his silhouette framed against the glowing horizon as he performed his ritual. But over time, the animal allowed her closer. She took images of him resting in the shade by her house, his eyes half closed yet alert, of him lying near Layla as she read on the porch, of him standing poised in the nave of the church, a guardian of memory. Each photograph carried not only the subject, but the weight of what it meant, the knowledge of a past devotion reborn in the present. Through her lens, she felt her own heart begin to loosen, the grief she had carried shifting from burden into tribute. Work gave her clarity, but it was Layla who gave her hope. The child flourished in the small town, her laughter filling corners that had once known only dust and silence. She turned the overgrown yard into a small garden, pulling weeds with patient determination, planting wildflower seeds that she had begged Maria to buy from a roadside vendor. Every morning she checked the soil, waiting for the first sprouts. Her resilience reminded Maria of the stubborn plants she had seen growing from cracks in stone foundations, life pushing forward no matter how harsh the conditions. Watching her daughter bend over the earth, her fingers dirty and her eyes alight, Maria realized that she too could grow again, that her life was not condemned to remain frozen in mourning. The evenings, once the most difficult time of day, changed as well. Maria no longer approached the Howl with dread. She sat with Layla outside the church, or sometimes on the porch of their house, and listened to the long, sorrowful cry. It still vibrated in her chest, still stirred memories of comrades lost, but it no longer unmoored her. Instead, it felt like a hymn, a ritual of remembrance that gave structure to grief rather than letting it consume. Echo became not only a dog who haunted the ruins, but part of their family, though he never abandoned his duty. He would spend hours at their side, patient and calm. But when the sun began its descent, he always rose and walked the familiar path to the church. Layla would wave after him, whispering that he was going to sing to the stars again, and Maria, instead of flinching, would smile. In time, the photographs formed a collection that told the story not only of the past, but of the present. Maria printed them carefully, each image developed with the precision of a soldier following orders, yet infused with the tenderness of someone preserving something sacred. She titled the series Echo's Legacy, and when Alara saw the work, she insisted that it be shown to others. Not in a gallery far away, among critics who would dissect composition and tone, but here, in the community hall of her people, where the story belonged. Maria hesitated at first, but the warmth in Alara's eyes and the certainty in her voice convinced her. The night of the gathering was unlike any Maria had known since her return from war. Families arrived in quiet groups, children chasing one another outside until called in, elders walking with measured steps, their faces solemn but expectant. Maria set up her projector against the far wall of the hall, her hand steady despite the thudding of her heart. When the lights dimmed and the first image appeared, silence fell. Photograph after photograph filled the screen. The loneliness of the empty streets, the dignity of the stone church standing against the desert, the graves bathed in light, the solemn figure of Echo lifting his head in song. The final image, captured during a storm-lit sunset, showed him as a dark silhouette framed by crimson sky, his body braced and noble. A collective breath passed through the room, and Maria felt the connection bind them all together. When the lights returned, there was no applause. Instead, one of the elders rose slowly to his feet and bowed his head, his eyes glistening. Others followed, and Maria felt tears sting her own eyes. In that moment, she understood that the story was no longer hers alone, nor the town's, but a gift shared across generations. She gave the prints to Alara, placing them in her hands, as though returning an heirloom, and the woman accepted them with gratitude that needed no words. The following days were lighter than any Maria had known in years. She no longer awoke, haunted by explosions and cries. She still remembered, still carried the faces of her comrades, but the memories no longer cut like blades. They lived within her, as part of her, transformed from wounds into marks of loyalty. She began to imagine a future in the town, not as a visitor, but as a resident. She found a small studio space near the edge of the square where she could continue her photography. Layla enrolled in the small school that still operated, her laughter echoing among the few other children, her hands often stained with soil from the flowers she nurtured. Echo became a constant presence, padding silently through the streets during the day, lying near their porch in the afternoons, but always keeping his sacred vigil when the sun fell. One evening, Maria sat on the porch steps with Layla beside her, and Echo resting at their feet. The desert stretched before them, the horizon ablaze with the colors of another sunset. The dog rose, stretched, and began his familiar walk toward the church. Layla leaned her head against her mother's arm, and Maria wrapped her in an embrace. The howl came soon after, long and resonant, filling the twilight with its mournful beauty. But to Maria, it no longer sounded like sorrow alone. It was remembrance, it was loyalty, it was hope carried forward in sound. She closed her eyes and let the vibration move through her. For the first time since she had left the battlefield, she felt not broken, but whole. The Reverend and his dog had shown her that loyalty was not a chain, but a light to guide the living. Echo had become the vessel of that lesson, and she and her daughter were now part of the story too. The town her mother had once called home was no longer a place of endings. It was a place of beginnings, where memory was honored and life could take root again. As the stars emerged one by one, Maria breathed deeply of the desert night and felt peace settle into her bones. She had found her purpose not in running from her past, but in remembering, in giving voice to the silence. Layla's soft laughter and Echo's steady presence grounded her in the present. Tomorrow would bring new work, new photographs, new challenges, but tonight she was simply there, alive, whole, no longer fleeing. The howl faded into stillness, and in that stillness, Maria discovered not emptiness, but home. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.